Salim Vali is in education, actually, and is based at the University of Johannesburg. Robert van Niekerk. Oh, it's always nice to have academics on the panel, you know. There's always this bit of a thing about academics, but they are thinkers. Many of them are good thinkers.
And spoken word artists.
Okay. Another spoken word artist here is Robert van Niekerk, who's at Rhodes University in the Institute of Social and Economic Research. Then I have Brooke Spector, who's one of my other favorite kinds of human beings, a journalist. Well, that's what he is at the moment. He used to be a diplomat and worked for the American Embassy. We make very clear that Brooke speaks here absolutely as Brooke Spector and not for any government when he says anything this afternoon. And Ian Robinson, you will know as Ewok, a true spoken artist, or one who really does it with style and rhythm, which the rest of us can't quite make claim to. Okay. So let me outline a little. I think this afternoon's conversation is quite a complex one. These are very important conversations and debates to have, but they are quite complex. And charting one's way through this territory is also fairly complex. As South Africans, and we're not all South Africans by any means, but as South Africans, we lived through a process and a period of cultural boycott in addition to other kinds of boycotts. And it was a particular, I was going to say weapon, but tool, strategy on behalf of those who wanted to see a change, a political change in our country. And I suppose the complex thing, one of the complex things about a cultural boycott is that it takes something that is intended, culture, arts, intended to be free and boundaryless, and flowing and able to touch and move and reach across cultures and boundaries and political edges and so on and so on. It takes that and turns that into a tool of a political aim. So that relationship between those two types of energy, those two types of endeavor is a complex, I think, a complex relationship to put together. And we'll explore that in some ways. But then also there is the situation where we deal in general, and we've framed the question as a general one, cultural boycotts, are they effective? And it would be nice to know, wouldn't it? You know, when you call for these kinds of things, how do you know what you're getting into? How do you know that the strategy you've embarked on actually has the ability to deliver for you what you are aiming for or hoping for? So the big general question is an important one to engage with, and it's important to engage with it in that abstract intellectual way. But then there are also specifics around us. And so we're going to try and straddle these different kinds of things. We're also straddling the general and the personal, and we will do that on the panel too. Some of the panel will speak in those kind of general terms. Some of the panel will remind us of our history and remind us what lessons we can draw from the past, and some of us will speak very personally. I'm going to start with Mike van Graan. Each of the panelists will make a shortish input, and then we'll probably do some clarifications, and the panelists, who are by no means all of one mind, let me tell you, if you had lunch with them 10 minutes ago, they will probably pose questions to each other or want to challenge each other, and I think we might take that first, and then we'll open it up to the audience for further questions and conversation. But I think, Mike van Graan, we want to start with you because of your location in Africa working with African artists. Thank you.
Okay, well, let's begin there. I'd like to approach this question based on experience of the broader African context through Arterial Network, which is a Pan-African civil society network of artists and cultural activists that seek to develop the arts in their own right, but also as a means to contribute to democracy, to respect for human rights, and the eradication of poverty. I'd like then also to preface what I have to say with 5 little stories. First, a range of organizations in Cape Town is considering a boycott of the Labia Theatre because of its refusal to show Roadmap to Apartheid, a film about why Palestinians themselves believe they are living in an apartheid state. Secondly, a few weeks ago, the ANC and the SACP called for a boycott of city press until such time that City Press removes a photograph of a piece of art, the spear, from its website. Third, last year the Swaziland Solidarity Network, COSATU and other allied organizations called for a cultural boycott of Swaziland and of the Bushfire Festival in particular. This year, a South African company, MTN, became the title sponsor of Bushfire Festival, and their 2012 audience was their biggest ever. The fourth story, a friend has as a Skype status that she will not buy anything made in China until they agree to an international plan to end the slaughter of Syrian people. And finally, a resistance festival of culture, a counter-festival to the National Arts Festival, where we are today, has been initiated by organizations representing the unemployed of Grahamestown, labeling this particular festival elitist. From the stories I've told, there are at least 3 reasons why cultural boycotts are embarked upon. First, as a political tactic or as a coercive strategy to bring about change. Such change can apply at a national level, changing a country, or an institution, such as the Labia. Secondly, as a means of raising awareness about a particular situation. So while the Resistance Festival is not calling for a boycott of the Arts Festival, they are highlighting the 70% unemployment in Grahamestown. Thirdly, as a matter of principle, the boycott is unlikely to bring about change or even raise significant awareness, but it is a statement of moral principle, whether by one individual, such as the woman who says that she's not going to buy anything from China, or by an institution, an organization, or a group. It's important to distinguish between these reasons, or the primary reason for instituting a cultural boycott, because too often what starts out as a political tactic becomes a principle, a kind of punishment meted out against an offending party, rather than understanding how to apply that boycott as a tactic within given situations. I'd like to talk a little bit about the African context. As we know from our own South African experience, the proposed media laws, the fascist response of the ruling alliance to the spear, the often brutal responses of the authorities to service delivery protests, all show that the struggle for democracy is an ongoing one. We haven't achieved democracy as such. We've witnessed similar struggles for human rights and freedoms in Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya. Within all of these, democracy still has a way to go. While there were only 3 African countries considered electoral democracies in 1890, there are 18 now, as opposed to 24 in the period 2005-6 to 2008-9, reflecting the fragility of democracy on the continent and the constant vulnerability to more autocratic forms of political authority. While the continent has seen significant economic growth in the last 15 years, with 7 of the fastest growing economies in the first 10 years of this millennium being African countries, that has not changed the fundamental conditions of most Africans, 50% of whom still live on $1.25 a day, which was the same statistic that goes back all the way to 1981, when the World Bank first introduced these kinds of measurements. Wealth has become the preserve of a politically connected elite, not only in our country, but, for example, the richest woman in Angola just happens to be the president's daughter. Most African governments do not support the arts, and where they do, there's little tolerance of art that is critical of the status quo. In many countries, artists are jailed, intimidated, harassed, assaulted, and killed for daring to exercise freedom of creative expression. Fates not unlike those of journalists, whistleblowers, and political activists. As Arterial Network, we organize civil society activists precisely to promote, defend, and monitor freedom of expression, to build organizations and leadership capacity to hold governments accountable, and in so doing, contribute to democratic practice and respect for human rights. With so many countries, including our own, disrespectful of human rights, democracy, and guilty of perpetuating poverty, it makes little sense for us as an organization to impose blanket cultural boycotts in a one-size-fits-all manner, as we would have to do it for most African countries, including our own. Do we have media boycotts of countries that suppress the media, imprison and kill journalists? For me, the arts play a very similar role, or can play a similar role, because the arts can also be very much part of asserting the hegemony of those in power as well. I have a little thing about what our South African experience was, having been involved at that time, but I'm going to leave that to colleagues to basically do, and maybe just conclude with a position on cultural boycotts that might make sense for us from within our continental experience. The first point to make is that cultural boycotts are legitimate change tactics and principled expressions of moral outrage. While they are employed as political, or where they are employed as political tactics, it needs to be made clear as such, because it may be that while repressive political conditions may be the same for country X and for country Y, or the conditions in country X may even be worse than in country Y, a cultural boycott is applied on country Y because of the particular nature and state of the struggle for justice there. The cultural boycott is a political tactic in that particular instance, to be applied strategically rather than a political principle that is applied to all countries experiencing a similar set of anti-democratic or anti-human rights regime. So looking for consistency in the application of the boycott is simply not going to happen. For this reason, there is no cultural boycott of China, despite its poor human rights record, or of the USA, despite Guantanamo Bay or its illegal wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And there was no cultural boycott of South Africa during its genocide against people living with HIV. In closing, cultural boycotts as a political change tactic or as a means to raise awareness, one, on their own are relatively meaningless, having more symbolic value, and are most effective when, first, they are part of a broader coordinated strategy that includes more forceful change tactics, particularly economic and political sanctions and the like. And secondly, where there is broad political support for such strategies from wider society and internationally from African and global communities. Secondly, in my view, they should be applied selectively, on the one hand targeting governments and the associated elites who are responsible for the relevant injustices, and on the other, supporting progressive artists and cultural organizations as vehicles to promote and defend human rights and freedoms. Thirdly, they should be devised and implemented in consultation with progressive cultural organizations and artists in the country concerned, rather than simply be imposed, as was the case in Swaziland, where last year they kind of imposed this cultural boycott and the artists felt, you know, we're not going to go along with it because we are simply being, in this very undemocratic way, being obliged to go along with it. And then you have companies like MTN actually providing much greater support to the Swaziland regime than what arts and culture organizations could. And finally, they require, as a political tactic, constant monitoring and adaptation to ensure the effectiveness of the tactic, hence the need for some kind of mechanism to monitor and to change the tactic as necessary. These, for me, then, are the broad principles to consider when thinking about and applying a cultural boycott. As to whether they work or not, this would be related to the conditions of struggle prevalent at the time, the political maturity and vision of the implementers, and the ongoing strategic adaptations made in accordance with changing conditions and time frameworks. Thank you.